Okay, I see a few people logging in. Just wanted to welcome you to today's program, part 2 in our series Home Safe Home. And we will get started here momentarily in about 3 minutes. Thank you for logging in early. It helps to make sure your sound is working and that you're all set for the program. We also will be streaming this live on YouTube and Facebook. So if you have any technical issues, you can always jump over to the CPF Facebook page or go to our YouTube channel. I believe YouTube is youtube.com/calpreservation and Facebook is facebook.com/capreservation, and then click on the video tab to watch the live stream. We are also going to make today's program available pretty much immediately as a recording, and you'll find the recordings on those same links, which I can share with everybody in the chat box later. Today's program is going to be 2 hours in length. We have, my understanding is we have 2 speakers with slides and some interactive components. So we do encourage you to use those polling features. We're going to be asking 3 questions today, and that'll help us sort of make plans for future programs as well. One of the questions we'll be asking you is what time you prefer to have these programs. So we hope you'll join us in answering those responses. We have another 2 minutes before the start of the program. If you have any questions or concerns or issues, you can always use the chat box. If you have questions for our panelists, please do use the Q&A box. That allows us to moderate questions and filter through them. We might get a lot of questions today. So for questions, you can also upvote or comment on questions. There's an option there. So if you see a question that you would like answered, asked by somebody else, you can always click the thumbs up symbol next to that question, and that'll ensure that we address the question earlier. With that being said, we do recommend that you ask your questions early. You don't necessarily have to wait until the Q&A period to ask your questions. You can do it at any time. We have about 1 minute before the start of the program, so we'll get started here in a minute. I wanted to welcome everybody to today's program. My name is John Haber. I'm the Field Services Director for the California Preservation Foundation, and we are now going to start part 2 of our series, Home Safe Home. This part is entitled, Is Compatible Matchy-Matchy? What are the Secretary of Interior standards and what do they have to do with my home? So we have 2 presenters today who will be joining us momentarily, but first I wanted to mention a few things about questions. You can ask your questions by clicking on the Q&A box. When you click on that, you'll have an option also to upvote or comment on other questions. So if you have any questions you'd really like addressed, you can use that feature. We also will be taking questions through social media. This stream will also be live streaming on Facebook and YouTube Live. So if you have any issues with Zoom, you can always jump over to there. The chat box is for anything else you'd like to mention to us, any issues you may have. With that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Jeanne Saunders with the State Office of Historic Preservation, who will be introducing the series from the OHP, and then she'll introduce our first panelist here.
Thank you, John. I'm Jeanne Saunders. I'm the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer and the Tribal Liaison for the Office of Historic Preservation. So excited to be welcoming you here tonight, this evening, for our second in a series of workshops on seismic safety and rehabilitating historic homes. We're very excited to be able to be partnering with the California Preservation Foundation and a number of outside consulting firms to be able to bring you these workshops throughout the course of the rest of this year. This one, as John mentioned, is going to focus focus on the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, with an emphasis on the treatment standards for rehabilitation of historic properties, which is what most homeowners will probably be using when they're looking at working on their historic homes. So excited to be bringing this to you this evening and to be joining you. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Christina to start off the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeanne. If we can, oh, perfect. I'd like to welcome everybody as well. My name is Christina Dykas. I'm an associate principal and architectural historian at Page & Turnbull. I will be joined today by my colleagues Flora Chu in Los Angeles and Hannah Simonson in San Francisco. Page & Turnbull has been providing historic preservation, architecture, and planning services in California and beyond for almost 50 years. Next slide. So we're very pleased to be here for workshop number 2 in this series of 6 workshops focused on seismic safety and rehabilitating historic homes. The first 2 are basic education workshops about how to understand historic properties to set the background for the more technical seismic workshops to follow. So we certainly hope that you'll tune in for our upcoming workshops as well. The case study examples are pretty California focused, but if you are joining us today from another state, we hope that the examples will apply to properties where you live as well. Multidisciplinary contributions throughout the series will come from architectural historians, historic preservation architects, building materials conservators, and structural engineers. In addition to the California Office of Historic Preservation, our partners in this effort include structural engineers from Structural Focus and Melvin Green and Associates, as well as the California Preservation Foundation, who is running this Zoom webinar tonight. Next slide, please. So as we've mentioned earlier, we're starting with the basics of historic preservation. This workshop focuses on an introduction to national guidance, including the Secretary of the Interior standards and guidelines for treatment of historic properties, as well as other available guidance. We'll be providing general examples to illustrate these concepts, as well as some specifics related to structural strengthening. Today's presentation will be about an hour to an hour and a half in length within the 2-hour schedule, and we'll answer questions at the end of each section topic. So please send questions via the Zoom chat or Q&A at any time in the presentation, and then at the end, we'll continue to answer questions until we run out of time or questions. And as John mentioned at the beginning, we do have a couple of interactive polls, so we hope you will participate. Next slide. So the objectives for today's workshop. Following this workshop, we hope you will be able to define and differentiate between the Secretary of the Interior standards 4 approaches to treating historic properties. Those are preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. We hope that you'll be able to identify resources that will help you to understand and apply the standards to your project. Analyze how the standards for rehabilitation might apply to common repair and alterations, and predict how your project may impact historic features and characteristics. Next slide. So here's the first poll. This should be popping up on your screen. We asked this one at our first workshop, and we'd like to just ask it again to get a sense of who's in the audience. So please answer, and then we'll move on. Thanks. I'm not seeing any. There we go. All right, thank you so much. We have definitely a combination of people in the audience. We do have folks who have historic resource properties, houses, and others who don't know or here for general information, and we welcome you. Thanks for joining us. All right, let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to hand it over at this time to Hannah, and she's going to start us off with the meat of the program, and then we'll hear from Flora later. Thanks.
Thanks, Christina. So I'm just going to do a kind of brief overview of the content that we discussed in the previous workshop, which was the first workshop of this series. As John mentioned, the workshops have been recorded. So if you missed the first workshop and want to go back and watch it, that recording is available on the CPF website. So we discussed the different types of historic properties that we address in the field. These definitions are provided to us by the National Park Service and the California Office of Historic Preservation. And these terms and concepts that I'm going to go over briefly are all helpful because they'll inform our further discussion today about the Secretary of the Interior standards. So there are 5 basic categories of historic properties: buildings, structures, objects, sites, and districts. Since this workshop series is generally focused on historic houses, we're really talking about buildings, which are properties that house human shelter, are used to shelter human activity, and also historic districts, which are collections of buildings as well as structures and objects. So those are the 2 primary types of historic properties that we'll be talking about. We also talked about what makes a place historic. So there are really 3 aspects of this, and these are all kind of work together. So to have a historic resource, you have to have a historic context, historic significance, and historic integrity for a property to be eligible as a historic resource. Historic resources do have defined periods of significance. Often this is the year of construction if a building is significant for its architecture, but a property may have a period of significance that spans multiple years, especially if you're in a historic district. And historic resources always have physical characteristics or character defining features that convey their significance. And the retention of those character defining features is important to their integrity. So all of these things kind of interplay together. This is another way of thinking about historic context, significance, and integrity. Historic context is the theme, place, and time that a property is connected to. Historic significance can be related to a number of topics, including events, significant persons, or design or architecture, as well as information potential, which is often archaeological resources. And then historic integrity has 7 aspects, which are listed here. And again, we discussed these in greater detail in the first workshop, but this is a little refresher of some of those terms and concepts that inform historic resources. We also talked about character defining features and how we identify character defining features on historic properties. So a helpful way to think about this is looking from kind of a zoomed out large scale view down to a focused kind of fine grained view. So looking at the setting of a property as well as its size and scale and massing, and then kind of zooming in on the different features and materials down to the specific treatments and small decorative features. And typically when we're looking at private residences, interiors, and things like mechanical systems may not be under the purview of review by different regulatory agencies, but still I think we all recognize that interiors of historic properties can be very significant, and so sometimes we do want to pay attention to those and pay attention to preserving them. This is a photo of a Tudor Revival style residents. And this was just one of a few examples where we kind of discussed what different character defining features might be on different property types. So this is calling out a few different features on this particular house as an example of the Tudor revival style, but depending on what a property is significant for, it may have different character defining features. So this was just one example. And like I said, all of these concepts help us understand the Secretary of Interior's standards for the treatment of historic properties and how to apply these standards when we're looking at a proposed project. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to the Secretary of the Interior standards. This is kind of a mouthful, so sometimes we call these simply the standards or the SOI standards. So if you hear those terms, that's what we're talking about. The standards were developed by the National Park Service, which is within the U.S. Department of the Interior. And the standards are a series of concepts about maintaining, repairing, and replacing historic materials, as well as designing new additions or making alterations to historic properties. And there are 4 distinct treatment approaches that each have their own set of standards. The Park Service has also provided guidelines, including these illustrated guidelines that provide additional guidance for how to apply the standards for different project types. So you'll hear us talk about both the standards and the guidelines. So the standards are what I'm going to talk about now. The standards, like I mentioned, were developed by the National Park Service. So they are used by federal agencies, but also state and local officials. It's common that state and local officials use them for reviewing different types of rehabilitation or proposed projects. And historic district and planning commissions across the country have adopted these standards in their review process. So they're really used at all levels. So there are 4 different treatments of historic properties that are defined by the National Park Service. They're preservation, restoration, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. And I think that often terms like preservation and rehabilitation and restoration get kind of thrown around and maybe used a bit interchangeably and just kind of, common discussions, but these do have very specific and nuanced definitions according to the National Park Service. So we'll just try to go over these briefly and help you understand what the difference between the 4 are. So the first treatment is preservation, which focuses on the maintenance and repair of existing historic materials and the retention of a property in its form as it has evolved over time. In this case, the Hilburn House was designed as a private residence and then had kind of a series of different lives, I think as a commercial site and several other different uses. So it has changed a bit over time, but has been preserved with its character defining features and its extant materials all intact. The preservation treatment is really primarily appropriate when the materials and features that are significant to the property are essentially intact. So there's no need to do extensive repair or reconstruction of any features or parts of the resource. And also if a continuing use does not require any extensive alterations or in terms of additions or kind of upgrades, for example, accessibility or something like that. So those are the cases in which preservation would be the most appropriate treatment. The next treatment is rehabilitation. And this is the most flexible of the 4 treatments and is the most commonly used in these types of residential projects, especially for seismic upgrades, as we're talking about, or for additions and things like that. And rehabilitation acknowledges the need to alter and add to a historic property to meet continuing or changing uses while retaining the property's historic character. So that's why it's a little bit more flexible than that preservation treatment approach. Within the framework of rehabilitation, repair and replacement of deteriorated features may be appropriate, as well as alterations or additions to the property to continue its use or to adapt it to a new use. And in this case, rehabilitation is appropriate if depiction to a specific period of time is maybe not the desired goal or not appropriate, which leads me to restoration. And restoration is really about depicting a property at a particular period of time in its history. So that might include removing evidence from other periods if there's been kind of additions or accretions over time, removing those back to a specific period, or if features have been lost over time, that might be a consideration as well. But this really goes back to that concept of a period of significance. In this case, we're looking at the rear side of the Leland Stanford mansion prior to a restoration. So you can see that there are quite a lot of accretions and additions and alterations that have appeared over time. But in this case, restoring the mansion, the Leland Stanford mansion, back to a particular period of time was deemed valuable to convey its significance. And in this photograph, you can see that it's been brought back to that condition. It's important that there is substantial either physical and or documentary evidence to be able to conduct this type of work, especially when you're bringing a property back to a condition. So that's an important consideration. And the final of the 4 treatments is reconstruction, which recreates vanished or non-surviving portions of a property for interpretive purposes. In this case, we're looking at a reconstruction of the old mill in Mill Valley. And again, having documentation to ensure an accurate reproduction is really essential to this treatment approach. Here we can see a historic photograph that is showing this old mill structure. And reconstruction is very rarely used, especially for entire buildings or structures, but it may be appropriate when it's essential to understanding the historic value of a site, or if no property with the same associative value has survived. So in rare cases, this can be an appropriate treatment approach. So since there are 4 treatment options, it is important to understand how to pick the best treatment option for your particular site and your particular project. So it's really about these 3 steps. First, evaluating for historic significance and integrity. So those are the concepts that we really focused on in workshop 1. So understanding why a property is significant, and at what level is it significant at the local level, or is it important to national history? What are its character defining features? And then next, assessing its physical condition, thinking about if there are any immediate stabilization needs, any maintenance, rehabilitation concerns, and what resources are available. So definitely weighing all of those factors. And then the last is planning for future use. Is the building going to be used for its historic purpose, or is it going to be adaptively reused for a new purpose? Is an addition necessary? And are there any kind of accessibility, structural, or code upgrades that are required? So the answers to these questions will lead you towards one treatment or the other. But like I said, rehabilitation treatment is by far the most commonly used and certainly is most likely to be relevant for seismic upgrades of historic properties, especially residences. So we have a little interactive exercise to recap what I just discussed about the 4 different treatment options. So if we can pull that poll up, there are 4 different scenarios on the left here. And in the poll, you should be able to select from a drop-down which treatment approach is the most appropriate. So there's one of each, if that helps. I guess that's kind of a hint. So I'll just read through these as you fill that poll out. So the first scenario is a project recreates a vanished or non-surviving portion of a property for interpretive purposes. The second scenario is a project depicts a property at a particular period of time in its history while removing evidence of other periods. The third scenario is that a project acknowledges the need to alter or add to a historic property to meet continuing or changing uses while retaining the property's historic character. And the fourth scenario is that a project focuses on the maintenance and repair of existing historic materials and retention of a property's form as it has evolved over time. So I know this is a little bit to think about. So take a moment to match up these scenarios with which treatment method you think is the appropriate way to address each scenario. And John, I'm just going to kind of leave it to your discretion when you think a majority of people have responded. Okay, great. So here are the answers visually up on the screen here. I think that most people got these pretty correct. Sorry, I'm trying to interpret the results, but the colors are like a little bit similar as I'm reading this. But I think that the important thing to note is when you're thinking about the difference in these treatment approaches, I think that these summaries are kind of helpful in kind of recapping with what the difference between each of them is. And it's really important to remember that concept of period of significance. So is a property being restored back to a specific period of time, as in restoration? Is it being preserved in place with its form as it has evolved over time, as in preservation, or is the property going to evolve to meet changing needs and uses while still maintaining historic character, as in rehabilitation? Or is it being entirely reconstructed, new construction, as in reconstruction? So hopefully that helps kind of distinguish between those 4. And I'm going to hand it over to Flora, who's going to get into more detail on the standard for rehabilitation, which is the most commonly used standard.
Great. Thanks, Hannah. And I'm pretty sure my video and audio are up, so let me know if they're not. So thank you. We'll get into a little bit more of the particular Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. But just wanted to note that all 4 of the treatments have their own set of standards. They about 8 to 10 of them, and they're not very long, each of them. They provide some of the flexibility, but once you decide on which treatment, it's very helpful to go take a look at the one specific to your project. And we're using the one for rehabilitation again because it is the one that's used most often, and it's the one that includes 2 standards related to new construction and additions, and offers the most flexibility for projects. So let's go to the next slide. On the right here are the 10 standards for rehabilitation in their long form and the specific language that they have. And you can see there's a link at the bottom for where you can find those. But we also wanted to provide some of the bridge version on the left, just with some key points to help you remember these 10 standards. And the ones that are highlighted are ones that tend to come up the most often for most projects, and are the ones where there is the most interpretation about how they are being applied. And really, these are ideas to help guide projects, to provide flexibility, since every project is different. And it's a little bit of how you want to interpret them, how whoever may be reviewing your project and approving it may be interpreting these standards. So we're going to go through each one and provide some examples at a very high level, using some examples that are useful, just thinking of them as a whole. And then we will talk a bit about the specific guidelines and applying these to seismic and structural systems. So let's go to the next slide. So Rehabilitation Standard 1 starts off really, it's about use and about continuing the historic use of a property, or in cases where we're talking about changing a use, adaptively reusing a building, just making sure that those uses are not requiring so many changes to the property that you start to lose what makes it a historic building. And an example that we have here with a house that was originally owned by a family that was one of the founding families for the area in North Hollywood, called the Weddington House, that was used as a residence for a very long time, had been abandoned for a bit, and then became part of a new development. Go to the next slide. A new residential multifamily development was constructed around it. You can see it in the background. And the house was kept and repurposed as a clubhouse for the residents there, as a meeting place that residents can use. And we're able to keep much of what made it a historic home, including some of the elements on the interior, but it had required upgrades for things like accessibility, as it's for a space that would now be used more as a gathering space. But this change in use was done, meeting Standard 1, in a way that required minimal changes to the property. Next slide. Rehabilitation Standard number 2 is actually one of the broader standards. It's really a general catch-all when we're talking about retaining the property's historic character and retaining that character by not removing those physical features that contribute to what makes a property historic, those character defining features that we've mentioned previously. In this case, this is a mid-century modern home in a residential tract that has a lot of those defining features that makes it a property of that style. It's got this gable roof that's open, and you can see some of the structural rafters within that. It's got carport in front, not very many windows, and it has some wood siding. And if we start to take away some of those features in the next slide, if those features are not preserved, we start to lose the character of the property. Yep, let's go back a couple. There we go. You can see here, we start to lose some of those characteristics. And that this no longer looks or feels like a mid-century modern house. So one of the important parts of the standard 2 is really to try to avoid losing too many of those features that make up the character of the historic property. Next slide. Standard 3 comes up occasionally. It's really a recognition that the property, as you're looking at it and starting a project, it's a physical record of its time and place, that there's an authenticity to it based on the history of that property specific to itself. So changes that create a false sense of history would not be something that you want to do, and standard 3 addresses that. So you don't want to add conjectural features, things that you're not sure about, that you can't show by physical evidence or by photo evidence or drawings, or add architectural features from another property that can then sort of muddy the waters about whether or not something at the property is historic. In this example, this house has some lovely art glass and stained glass, but in the research that occurred, it turned out that the stained glass elements there at the right were actually not from this property, but were added from a different historic house sometime in the 1970s. So that would be something that would not meet standard 3. Next slide. Rehabilitation standard number 4 is also another one that recognizes that the properties change over time, and that there are elements that may gain significance on their own, things like additions by different architects, and some of these properties have a very long history, so some additions and changes start to become significant in their own right. In this example, this addition at the second story was not an original element. It was actually added a few years after the original house was built, but it was also designed by the original architect not long after, and it's very compatible with the property. And now enough time has passed that it has also gained significance. It's now become a character defining feature of the property. So when you're working on a project, you would not want to say, remove that, because it itself has gained significance. Next slide. Rehabilitation standard 5. So we now get into some of the more technical aspect and physical aspects of projects. And this one in particular is about materials and finishes and features that are on a property. Examples that can show the craftsmanship that goes into what makes the property historic. And you want to preserve those elements. Again, changing too much of that, you start to lose those elements and features that make it historic. In this example, this house with its stone exterior is very much a distinctive feature of the property, and would have those elements of craftsmanship and finishes and material. And you can imagine removing all that would change the character of the property and would not meet standard 5. Next slide. Standard 6 goes into a little bit more detail and focuses on this hierarchy that we have in historic preservation and using the standards related to materials and the features of a building. So I'm going to take a little time and go through these sort of the 3 elements here. The first is really that the deteriorated features on a historic building should be repaired rather than replaced. That's really where we start with many of these elements. A lot of the elements can be repaired first. We're using windows as an example here just to illustrate. That window on the right may look kind of old and beat up, but it's essentially there. Many of the elements are there. It's not broken, and it can be repaired. Specific elements, specific pieces can be repaired without really affecting this as a material. And oftentimes when we're looking at historic houses, particularly with wood windows, these wood windows have lasted a long time and will continue to last a long time. They're often made with old growth wood that can be very resilient and be repaired. But at some point, a lot of the material gets to the point where it's so deteriorated, so damaged, or so broken that it does need to be replaced. So that's the second part of standard 6, where it gives some guidance on, at that point, if you are replacing elements that are deteriorated, that the new features that you're installing should match what's there historically. And several elements in design, color, texture, sort of the visual qualities, and where possible materials. So materials is one of the things to try to match, but it's the standard 6 recognizes that there are cases where materials may not be, matching the materials may not be the most effective option. But you can imagine here too, for example, with this window, if you want to match it, say, with these divided lights, and if you start putting in a window that maybe doesn't have those divisions or has too many of them, that again starts to change the character of the property. And the final part of standard 6 to keep in mind, this also gives guidance on replacing missing features. Going back to some of the things we've talked about before, if a feature is missing, it can be replaced if there's enough evidence, either physical evidence, or maybe another example at the building, or if there are photographs or drawings that can allow you to recreate it without too much guesswork. And that's really the sort of the key in replacing missing features. Let's go on to standard 7. Standard 7 continues to be about the treatment of the property. It's really wanting to ensure that as we're repairing and rehabilitating historic buildings, that we're not doing more damage. So this is about physical and chemical treatments, such as cleaning, making sure that those things are done in a way that uses what we call the gentlest means possible, finding ways that will not destroy the underlying material as you're doing those cleanings. And some of that may require things like doing some hand cleaning or using a gentle water wash instead of sandblasting. And it's usually helpful to meet the standard is to make sure there's some testing involved that can understand what would be the best approach without damaging the wood underneath or the brick underneath. Let's go standard 8. Standard 8 is more about archaeological resources that may be found in some projects. This comes up occasionally, that if there are archaeological resources, they should be protected and preserved. And if they have to be disturbed, they're making sure that there are mitigation measures undertaken. In this example, in this Adobe building, there was some original Adobe walls with painting that was found, and that wall itself ended up being protected, and a new covering was added on top of that to try to preserve the original walls. And a piece of it was kept open to just see what was behind there. Let's go standard 9. This is another standard. So this one is specific to the Rehabilitation Standard. It started to talk about additions and new construction and exterior alterations property. And this is also one that is used quite often and has several parts to it. The first part is really about making sure that any of these new additions or exterior alteration or construction that's happening next to or adjacent to a historic building does not destroy historic materials that characterize the property. So going back to making sure character defining features are not destroyed as part of the project. The second part then is making sure that these new elements are compatible with the historic building, that they sort of fit with the historic property, they don't overwhelm them, but at the same time, they're not too matchy-matchy. They're not so clearly copying what's there that you start to not be able to see what is historic and what is new. And in this example, we'll try to give an example of what compatibility may mean. There are a lot of different interpretations of that. But we're really looking initially at the mass size scale of a addition or a new construction related to a property. With this example that we have here, you can see a 2-story addition was added toward the back of the building. But when you look at it straight up, straight from the front, the addition is less noticeable. It is compatible with this one-story building. It doesn't overwhelm it, and it's set in the back, and you can see most of the features, the roof line of the historic building is still visible. And there are ways that addition differentiates itself, and that differentiation can be a whole range from very subtle to very visible and very distinctly different for the new elements. In this case, they went with something that was a bit more subtle. If you look closely, some of the wood siding has a different size than what is in the historic building. They took their cues from it, but did not copy it specifically. And if there are questions, we can talk about standard 9 more. It's one that comes up quite often. And standard 10, then, our last standard in the rehabilitation set, is also related to new additions and adjacent new construction, making sure that these new elements, if they are removed in the future, that they will not affect the historic buildings too much, that the essential form will still be there. And that again is sort of making sure those character defining features are not removed when you're doing something new to a historic property. And in this example, there was an elevator tower that was added to the back of this building that you can see was added with a glass hyphen. So trying to have a light touch against the historic walls, so that if that's removed in the future, those historic walls are essentially attacked and the building remains. So that's a quick run through of the 10 standards. Ideally, most projects will meet all 10 standards and in every component, but the standards provide enough flexibility that if it doesn't fully meet one standard, you want to look at the project as a whole and really holistically and just make a interpretation. Does the project as a whole substantially meet the standards? So we can pause there and check to see if there's any questions and take a look at the time. I think we're okay. But I'll ask John or see if there's any questions that have popped up.
Yeah, we have
one.
Yeah, we have 2 questions. One that I sort of partially answered, but now we have 3 questions. Would you like me to read it, or did you see them? I'm sure.
Yeah, if you can read them, that'd be great, John.
Okay. So first of all, the question in regards to standard 9, who gets to decide what is deemed compatible? The architect who is designing the addition, the agencies, or both, or someone else?
That's a great question for who decides how the standards are applied. And it really does depend on your project. And oftentimes, if your project is going through a process for review, whether that's a historic landmarks commission or at the planning staff level for a project, and you need some review to get the project approved, that would be the decision makers. And oftentimes it can be at the staff level, a planning staff person, a preservation planning staff person, who can take a look at the standards, take a look at the project, and make that determination about whether something's compatible. Sometimes it goes to a landmarks commission, who then can look at that and also make that determination.
There's a question from Alan, and I think he was referring to one of your first slides. I believe the house that you showed as an example. He's asking, during the period of significance, there was an addition at the back. Does that affect integrity at all?
I can take this one, Flora.
Great.
So I think this gets to some of the concepts that we discussed in a bit more detail in the first workshop, but if there are alterations to a building that happened within its period of significance, it's likely that those alterations or additions could contribute to the property's significance and may be considered character defining features in and of themselves. If there is an addition to the rear that is outside the period of significance, that addition potentially could have a negative effect on integrity, but depending on where it is, how it's designed, and how visible it is, the property could still retain historic integrity. So if it's an addition that's not visible from the public right of way, especially if it's a historic residents in a historic district, that addition probably wouldn't have such a negative impact on integrity that we would say that it's no longer a historic resource. But again, it all kind of depends on how it's designed. If it's much taller than the residence and kind of overwhelms it even from behind, potentially that could be an issue. But like I said, if it was built during the period of significance, it probably wouldn't have a negative effect on integrity.
John, did you want to answer that question as well? Or you've already done that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, you mean market is live as answered. Yeah, there's
Got
an
it.
interesting question here too. I don't know who it's an anonymous question, but the rock-faced house that you showed earlier, wouldn't that be a potential seismic hazard? And maybe you have some response to that.
It could be. That is a great question. Depending on how those rocks are attached to the building and how the building's constructed. If it really is created of rocks and masonry, how some of those elements are tied together would be one question. Or if what we're seeing really is something that's just attached to a structure that has a different structural system than what we're seeing, it may be less of a hazard. And I think some of that we will address in the next couple of workshops too, when we're looking at things like stone and historic houses. What would be the seismic hazards of those, and how would you approach that? And how would you do that in a way that can still retain that material and the historic character of the building?
Great. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. As someone who actually lived through and was woken up by the Northridge earthquake, I know how many people's chimneys fell over and how rock and mortar structures like that can be a potential hazard. So there will be all of this will be addressed in future sessions. And I believe part of this program, there will be some resources developed to look at these specific scenarios within a home. So I'll mark that as answered.
Okay.
And there was a question that came through that I sort of typed in a question, and as did Ruth Todd. And the question was about double pane windows. The issue was saying that, using the windows as an example, what if the code now requires double pane windows? Do you have a response to that? How can you navigate that? Say your local jurisdiction is telling you that you need double pane windows, you're a historic home. What sort of solutions are there for that?
I'm not sure if I saw the responses previously, so I want to make sure we're on the same page with that. But that is something that comes up quite often. I'll take a first stab at it, and Hannah, if you want to jump in, feel free. That is something that comes up quite often, and we come back to, are the windows a character defining feature for the property as the first step? If the windows have been altered already or are replacements, maybe installing double pane windows would not affect the historic character of a property and could, in fact, return some of the character to the property, because you can restore some of those elements and still make the building be double pane and meet some of the energy requirements. If the windows are historic and are character defining, there are some steps to take a look at first. Can you meet some of the requirements without replacing the windows? There are secondary windows that can be added in the back or on the inside that can provide some of the same thermal comfort levels, meet some of the same energy requirements. You sort of go through that same hierarchy. Can the windows be repaired first? Can they be adapted to meet some of those requirements? And then if not, and replacement is required, if you're replacing them, can you still match some of the characteristics and features of the historic windows? And a lot of that does come back to the question of how important are the windows to the building? And in some cases, they're very important. In other cases, that minor change to double pane windows may not be something that would affect the overall character of the property.
Yeah, I think Flora hit a lot of the important points. I see that John noted that historic buildings are exempt from Title 24 energy requirements in California. So those requirements would only apply to new construction. So they're not, retroactive in the same way. But Ruth also noted that in some cases you can retrofit original windows with double pane glazing, but it really depends on how thick, how wide your muntins and sashes are. So some windows that can be done, but not in all cases. So in some cases that might be an appropriate approach if so desired. But hopefully that kind of covered everything.
Yeah, I think there's a myriad of solutions depending, as Flora mentioned, on the case, whether or not that feature is a very important part of the structure and its character defining features. So I think I don't see any further questions. I'm checking social media here. We have Marta from Irvine. Just wanted to give a shout out to Irvine, but other than that, no, there's no social media questions. So I think if you were going to move on to the next sessions, we're free to do that now.
Great, thank you. I think I will continue then. We'll go into some of the tools that are available to help people apply the standards. And we've mentioned some of these already. Just want to let people know there are a lot of tools out there because the standards are intended to be very flexible. How you apply them requires some thought and some guidelines and guidance. So let's go to the next slide and we'll look at some of the ones we're talking about. So we're going to cover the guidelines for treatment of historic properties that come with the Secretary of Interior standards. These are illustrated guidelines that the National Park Service also put together to provide some recommendations in applying the standards. They are one set of tools that are available. There are some additional illustrated guidelines that go into more detail for specific project types or specific features like cultural landscapes or sustainability that is also available on the National Park Service website. There are also preservation briefs and tech notes, which we'll cover once we go through some of these guidelines that, again, give more specific guidance on specific topics. So we just want to make sure people were aware that these tools are out there and can help homeowners and help the people who are reviewing projects think about how the standards are applied. Next slide. So for the guidelines in particular that go with the standards, there are specific guidelines for each of those 4 treatments as well. There are guidelines for preservation, rehabilitation, reconstruction, and restoration. So depending on your project and your approach, you want to make sure that you look at the correct guidelines. We're again going to use the rehabilitation guidelines since those are the most widely used and provide the most flexibility. But each of the 4 treatments, the guidelines for each of the 4 of them are organized by topic. So they're organized in pretty similar fashion with many of the same recommendations. And just want to point out, so for example, if you have a brick building or a building with some wood elements, you may want to look under building materials for those specific guidelines on that material. Structural system, there's a whole section on structural systems in these guidelines. They're found under the building features and systems. So we'll go through some of that. And we also want to point out that there's also a section on code require work within these guidelines that often come up when you're dealing with structural systems or seismic upgrades, as that ties in with some of the building code requirements. But some of the key things to remember for all of these is with any of these historic projects, it's going to be a balance between when you're repairing something or replacing something, keeping what's historic, keeping what adding something new, and that compatible and different. Those apply to all of these projects, and you really want to just keep that in mind. There's no one right solution all the time. Each project is going to be different. Let's go to the next slide. So for the rehabilitation treatment, we want to go through and just these sort of 5 steps that are outlined in the guidelines and make sure we can touch a little bit on them and get into a little more detail. These are pretty similar for the other 3 treatments, though, again, remember rehabilitation is the one that allows for additions. So this one does have a step 5 when you're looking at additions and alterations for new uses. And the graph or the flowchart on the right is helpful, just sort of illustrate that treatment hierarchy we've been talking about with wanting to repair and retain original features first before you replace them. But if something's altered, there's some more flexibility of how you approach those. Let's go to the next slide then. So this is first step when you're looking at structural systems in these guidelines for applying the standards. One of the first things to do is to identify, retain, and preserve. So this goes back to identifying what is character defining about the property, and is the structural system something that is character defining? And sometimes it can be. Some of the visible features of a structural system, in this case, in this example in the background, this wood truss at the ceiling is a structural system, but it's also very much a character defining feature of this property. It really is part of this historic interior space. And it may be things like brick walls that we've seen on some buildings, or rock walls on the exterior of a building. If it is part of the structural system of the building and are character defining, you want to make sure you identify them and understand what they are and identify those as elements to preserve and see how those can be done. You sort of want to make sure some of the not recommended things when we're looking at just identify and retain is make sure that the existing system isn't overloaded, and that you don't want to sort of wholesale replace those structural systems that are part of the character defining features of a historic property without just as a first pass. You sort of want to see if there are other ways to keep them and reinforce them and rehab the project. Let's go to the next slide. So the second step is really to protect and maintain those structural systems that are existing. You want to make sure that they aren't damaged and are not deteriorating. So it may be as simple as keeping gutters and downspouts clear so that water doesn't become an issue for roofing and any of the structural systems around the roof. In this case, this example, if there's a wood beam, you want to make sure that there's not insect infestation that is ongoing. You want to make sure those are addressed first to protect and maintain and stabilize the property, and then evaluate and see what is needed to meet some of your requirements for the structural system. Next slide. So step 3 is then repair. What does the structural system need, and can it be repaired by adding components? So this is an additive element rather than removing it wholesale. Can you reinforce or supplement weakened structural members through pairing or sistering with a new member, or adding bracing or new metal plates and connectors? And can that be done in a way that minimizes the impact on the historic fabric and historic character? At times, some of these repairs can be done in places that are not visible, maybe in the attic or basement where you won't see them. And so you can add to them without really impacting the overall character of a historic property. Next slide. And then in some cases, you may have to replace the structural system or parts of them because they are damaged or deteriorated, or they're missing, or they do need sort of more intensive interventions than just repair. And at times it may be you're not just replacing in kind. That's the first step if you can replace in kind. But the second step is sometimes you have to do a new substitute material. In those cases, you want to make sure that the substitute material is physically compatible with the existing system, that it does provide the structural needs that is intended, and that if it is going to be visible, it has some of the same forms, design, and appearance of the structural system. In this example in the background, you can see that a new steel moment frame, a new steel bracing was added for this apartment building at the underside. What often comes up, what we've heard in the past in recent times, talking about soft stories where the first floor may need some more bracing. There are probably ways to install that can be a bit more compatible, that maybe can hide that a bit more so it's not so visible and doesn't match with sort of the overall character of the historic building. Next slide. And the fifth step, again, is really for the alterations and additions for a new use under the Rehabilitation Standard. It's sort of making sure that the structural system that you do have can accommodate the new use, that it still preserves those character-defining features if they're visible, that are part of the structural system. And that as you're putting in new elements like new mechanical or electrical equipment, you're not having to make too many changes or cutouts in the structural system in order to do that. Under the not recommended is also a couple of things to keep in mind. Oftentimes when you're doing an addition, you may have to excavate near a historic building. You want to make sure if that's happening, that's not going to impact the foundations of the historic building, so that you don't want to damage that while doing work for the new additions. And also as changes are happening, that they can be sensitive to interior spaces, and that you're not damaging some of the character defining features that may be on the interior as well. Next slide. And we just have a quick slide here about code required work and life safety. That's a term that you may hear quite often, and really is one of the most important things about any of these historic projects on historic properties is you want to make sure the building is safe. That is the overarching goal. And that still can be done in a way to make sure that the historic character of the property is maintained. And often the life safety requirements is what's driving a lot of the seismic work and the structural upgrades. So it's a lot of the same things we've talked about, making sure we identify and understand what is character defining about the property, and take a look at the project and see if you can comply with the life safety codes while preserving those character defining features. There are also options to work with code officials to think about how to meet those code requirements while preserving the historic property, especially in some local cities, as more and more of them are using the California Historical Building Code for not just for seismic, but for all different types of projects and properties. More local code officials are becoming more familiar with those and understanding how you can apply them to historic properties. And those really just provide an alternate means of meeting code compliance. Are there other ways to meet that requirement without impacting too much of the character of the building? Next slide. We want to briefly also touch on these preservation briefs and preservation tech notes as additional guidance and additional resources that are out there. Like we say, these get into some more technical information, get into more specific information for some materials in particular. And there actually is a preservation brief for seismic rehabilitation of historic buildings. These are also available on the National Park Service's website. And I believe we've included the preservation brief on the seismic rehabilitation in the handouts that and the additional information that go with this presentation that will be available on the California Preservation Foundation's website. Let's go to the next slide. And just to let you know that this preservation brief is fairly up to date, and it goes into more technical information. But some of the 4 principles that they talk about when you're planning a seismic rehabilitation summarizes very clearly some of the things we've been talking about here about preserving and retaining the historical structure system and not replacing it wholesale as one of the first approaches. That whole thing about wanting to replace, if you're having to replace or you want to repair, and then if you're having to replace, it's replace in kind or with compatible substitute materials. And then any new systems, you want to make sure it works in concert with the existing historic buildings, and that structural system respects the character of the historic property, and is not visually obtrusive, and not call attention to itself too much. And then the last thing, it should be reversible. Tying this all back to the Secretary of Interior Standards, the Standard 10, the seismic work should be reversible without allowing the historic property to still have its essential form. Next slide. So let's pause there again. Let's see if there's any other questions. We just went through a whole bunch of some more technical information before we get into some case studies. But if we don't have any questions, we can go on to these, just a couple of case studies to help you remember and apply the standards and these guidelines.
Just a comment from David saying he, as somebody who works on as wood window restorer, he thinks going double pane is almost impossible with historic windows, and that energy calculations should allow for a single pane. So I will dismiss that. And
that's a good comment, and he's right that sometimes it can be very difficult in a wood window with trying to create enough space for that double pane specifically in there. Sometimes there may be other options like laminated glass that is as thin as single pane or just a little bit thicker, but that can provide you some additional thermal protection. It may not be as much as double pane, but it is also another way to retrofit an existing wood window.
Okay.
So there are a wide variety of options.
That's all I see. So, and just a reminder to everybody, please continue to use the Q&A box. We'll keep an eye on it. You can answer those, or you can ask those questions anytime, and then we'll address them periodically as we continue. So, okay.
Thanks, John. So I'll turn it over to Hannah to start us off and talking about a couple of our case studies.
Thanks, Laura. I did see a question come in right as you said that, so I guess I can go ahead and address it right now. The question is, do the Secretary of the Interior guidelines deal with the visual impacts of driveways and walkways? And I do believe there is a section of the guidelines that discusses setting and streetscapes. So those things I do believe are addressed, but Flora, Christina, feel free to chime in if you think I'm wrong.
No, I believe you're right. There is a section on site features and setting, and they may address driveways and other elements just around the buildings.
And then another question came in about solar photovoltaics on roofs of historic buildings, and are they allowed? And the short answer is that yes, they can be done in sensitive ways, and there are guidelines that address that. In the guidelines that we've been discussing, there also is an additional set of guidelines issued by the Park Service specifically addressing sustainability. And so issues like solar panels and other kind of sustainability-minded retrofits are even addressed in greater detail in those guidelines. And we have provided a link to those guidelines in our handout, so you can check there for additional information. And I just answered that live, so I'll mark it as done. Okay, I think that's all of the questions for right now, and we can, if any others come in, we'll address them at the end of the presentation. But for now, I will move on to a couple of case studies to look at the concepts that we've been discussing as applied to some seismic retrofit projects. So the first case study is a property, the George Key Ranch in Orange County. It was built in 1898. The ranch house did suffer some damage in the 2014 earthquake. And at that point, the county recognized the need to do some seismic upgrades to the property. So there were a couple of different approaches that were taken to address this overall concern. So among the approaches, there was an effort to reinforce and attach the unreinforced concrete block columns at the front porch. There was supplemental strengthening in the attic, and the addition of new shore board to increase shear capacity at some of the perimeter walls at the interior spaces. So I'll get a little bit more into detail on each of those in a second. But these approaches really did address the Secretary of the Interior standards and the guidelines that Flora discussed, especially in terms of retaining the overall character of the property. These were interventions that were very incision-like in their approach, and also strategically located at areas that are either not publicly accessible, like the attic, or are not as visible. So the overall character of the property has not changed. And the standard 5, the character defining features and materials, likewise have been retained. The project did involve the removal of some material and replacement with new material, which we'll discuss in a little bit more detail, but overall, the vast majority of those character defining features and materials remain extant. So it's really addressing these relevant standards here. A few more detail photographs. So in this upper left-hand photo, you can see these concrete block columns. So originally these were built as unreinforced columns, but this use of concrete block is, it's quite an early use of this concrete block, and it's certainly character defining to the property. So of course, you know, based on what we've been discussing, it would not be appropriate to say, remove these columns entirely and replace them with new reinforced concrete block or something of that nature. So instead, the approach was to add new anchor plates and bolt them into the columns and add reinforcing in place. So this was deemed to be a more appropriate approach given the character defining nature of this material and this feature. And those bolts and plates, I think you can kind of see from this photo up here that it doesn't look like much has changed. So from the exterior visually, this all, you know, looks unaltered, which is great. There were also additional metal straps added to support the chimney inside the attic. So some additional strengthening added there. This is a really nice approach since it's adding additional strengthening in a place that most people are never going to see, which is the attic. Likewise, there were some supplemental straps and braces added to the rafters near the ends of the walls. So again, this is in an area that's very discreet. Probably no one's going to notice. Also, this approach is very much additive rather than subtractive, which is to say we're adding additional supports and strengthening, but not removing any historic materials or features. And if for some reason in the future these added structural supports needed to be removed, there wouldn't be any drastic impact to the overall character or integrity of the property. And then in the interior, there was removal of some of the original historic wood lath and plaster wall at at this interior corner. You can see, I think in the very upper left of this left photo, you can see a bit of that still remaining in the corner. But the approach was to be strategic and remove only, the amount that was needed to bring the property up to, the code or the seismic strength that they were after. So not replacing all of the interior walls. And in this process, there was additional metal strapping added to the wood framing. So you can see that here. And then this new board was added at the interior corner. So this is a steel and composite board that's kind of specifically designed to address seismic rehabilitation. So it adds shear strength here. So this can be added in discrete locations and then plastered over to give the same kind of visual appearance at the interior. But still, like I said, at least some of the original material has been retained, and this has not interrupted any of the exterior character of the building. So the decision was to prioritize having the alterations in these discrete areas of the interior as opposed to having an approach that maybe would affect the exterior of the building. And I'll hand it up to Flora to discuss this next case study, which takes a slightly different approach.
Sure. Thanks, Anna. So in this case study, it's also a ranch house. This is the Grant Park Ranch House, sort of similar vintage to the one that we were just looking at. This one is in Santa Clara County. And some of the needs of this building was similar to what we just talked about. There were some interventions that was more on the repair side that was less visible, but they also encountered the need to strengthen the sunroom in the corner that had two walls of windows essentially, and not as much shear strength or that it needed. And the question of how do you do that without changing the sunroom so much that you start to lose some of that character of all these windows. And so this was a more of a replacement approach for one part of it, and was a bit more of a intervention here in that corner with the yellow box. So we'll show some photos of that. And in this case, the most relevant standards were also standard 2, trying to retain the overall character of the building, not remove the sunroom or the elements that made it character defining, but using more of standard 6, trying to do a replacement that matched and was compatible with the existing building. Let's go to the next page or next slide. So in that corner, you can see in the top left there, the windows were removed to see what the structural system was like. And it was determined that the approach was to replace the wood frame here with a steel moment frame that you can see at the lower left image. They were able to do that in the same opening as the wall itself, so that it didn't require too much alteration to that opening into the walls, and still allowed then the windows to be put back in place in pretty much the same configuration, and can maintain that corner of the building. You can see in the top right image there with the historic windows put back in place, the members in between pretty much align with where they were before. And you can see on the other side of that chimney, the rest of the sunroom that did not have as intensive a intervention. The wood framing there could remain and could be repaired and upgraded without removing all of that. And you can just see the moment frame bracing there. And once the siding was put back on, much of the historic character remains for the space, this part of the building, and that sunroom still retains those elements of the windows and the openness of that as part of the character of the building. So this is an example where sometimes a project may have multiple interventions. This may require something more intensive. And it is really sort of case by case and what kind of project that comes up. I think that's it. We can wrap this. I think that's it for this case study.
Thanks, Laura. So I'm going to do a quick little summary here, and then we will wrap up the workshop with any final questions that folks have. So just as a quick summary, we first discussed the 4 different Secretary of the Interior standards treatments. So those treatments are preservation, restoration, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. And then we focused on the standards for rehabilitation. There are 10 standards for rehabilitation, and we focused on these standards because they're the most typically applicable to residential projects, particularly things like seismic rehabs. And then we also discussed the guidelines that go along with the Secretary of the Interior standards. So there's guidelines for all 4 treatments, and the guidelines for rehabilitation also do include specific guidelines related to structural systems. So we discussed this treatment hierarchy of essentially first attempting to retain and repair any original features and materials. And then if the feature or material cannot be repaired, then replacing it in kind or to match closely in terms of material design and other characteristics. And then based on this information, we just looked at a couple of quick case studies of how the standards and guidelines were applied to specifically seismic retrofit projects. And all of this information is going to further inform the following workshops, these upcoming workshops, which will get into retrofits, specifically seismic retrofits, in a much more detailed, fine-grained way. So you'll be well prepared to understand those upcoming topics. And before we jump into the last question that you guys have for us, we wanted to ask folks a question of you. So we did these first 2 workshops during this 5 to 7 p.m. time slot. But we're curious if for future upcoming workshops in this series, the workshops are scheduled on Tuesdays or Thursdays. If you have a preference for a particular time slot, including these kind of more midday time slots. So feel free to submit your feedback in the poll window that just popped up. You can select multiple time slots if one or more is appealing to you, but we're just curious in terms of planning the timing for our last 4 out of 6 workshops.
Okay, I'll just leave the poll up while we dive into the questions. I don't see any responses yet, so maybe people are fine with whatever.
Okay, that's fine. we may stick with this slot if there's no strong opinions otherwise, but yeah, we just wanted to ask.
Okay, I almost wonder if there's something wrong with the poll this time. But anyways, I just wanted to dive into the questions here. We have quite a few questions. It looks like. Wow. Okay. Oh, that was me. Okay, I'm glad there's people in the chat that are. Let me relaunch the poll. I'm sorry, people. Okay, there we go.
Okay, now we're seeing the poll, I guess.
Now the races are off and people are running. So okay. Yeah.
Great.
So I'll just let them respond while we go through some of these questions here. There was one really interesting question that I'll start off with while people are responding to this poll, and this is about the perception by this person that standards 3 and 9 are sort of incompatible with each other. And number 9, of course, is the one that talks about differentiation and compatibility. But number 3 is about the creation of a false sense of historical development. And I know geographically, it seems to differ how people deal with standard number 9 in terms of how different do you have to be from the historic building versus how much do you want to be in keeping with it. So I'm wondering what your thoughts were in terms of this sort of seeming contradiction between number 3 and 9.
I can start off on that if you want, Flora.
Sure.
I think that one important thing to note is that although these standards can seem like they're in conflict or in contradiction, I think one distinction worth remembering is that standard 9 is primarily about new construction, additions, or kind of substantial new work to a building. So I think that the commenter's example was she has or they have a door, a non-original door, and want to replace the door with a compatible door, but they don't know what the original door looked like. So, you know, there's a way in which you can be thinking about standard 9, but typically standard 9 is more about additions and kind of bigger scopes of new work. And the other standard about creating a false sense of historicism, one aspect of it is not introducing materials or features that have been kind of borrowed from other properties. So it might not be appropriate to take a historic door from another property and install it in your historic house. Whereas it may be appropriate to think about what era your house is from, what style it is, and choose a new door that is kind of in keeping with the typical style of door that was originally there. Another thing that we do like to kind of advocate for when folks are undergoing kind of rehabilitation or any types of project is also to document, you know, what you've done, and that can also be an important approach. But that's my initial thought. But Flora, I'm sure you have something to add to that.
No, I think you covered most of it. I will add that some of this may go back to that question. I think we reinforced a few times the recreating something that's missing based on documentation. If you have historic photos, or if you have something physical there that you can say, we know what was here, so it's not guesswork. But in cases where you don't have that evidence and you don't know what was there, what would be something that's compatible? And it tends to be the approach is you don't want to do something simpler, something that matches maybe the style of the building, that is something similar from that period, but is differentiated, going back to a little bit to standard 9, that can show future historians, future historic architects that this is something from this time period, not something that is old because of the way it's constructed, or the detailing is more simple than what you would expect from a similar feature that would have been original to the building. So even some of that subtle differentiation helps to make sure that you're not really copying what was original and trying to give that false sense of historicism.
Yeah, excellent points.
Helps.
Yeah, and often with, especially with larger projects and commercial projects, I'm sure both of you can speak to this, but they often, one of the solutions is to sort of create a hyphen between the addition and the historic structure, so that it's clear that there's a newer building next to an older building, even though they're compatible with each other. There's a lot of sort of nuance to the standards that we've done a lot of programs where architects have talked about how they deal with the challenges of not looking too much different, but not looking too much alike to the historic structure. So to put it in simple terms, so let's see here. We have another question.
And John, just before we go on to the next question, I guess another thing I would add is that the standards are, pretty brief, direct statements that sometimes I think it can be easy to kind of like get into this theoretical realm that is hard to apply practically. And the guidelines, the illustrated guidelines that have been issued by the Park Service are really, really helpful in kind of bringing it back down to reality and talking about more specific kind of cases in whether it be windows or doors or new additions. And so I think it's important to not forget about the illustrated guidelines because they're extremely helpful and can help direct you in a more kind of specific way.
Great, excellent point. And so a question coming from an anonymous attendee: what kind of professional should I call to inspect exterior bricks, steps, and a stoop that are developing cracks in the mortar? The whole assemblage seems to be pulling away from the house itself.
I can start that. You can start with a historic architect or an architect to sort of do that initial inspection. You may also include a structural engineer who is familiar with historic materials and things like brick steps that can also tell you a little bit about what is causing some of that movement, if there's movement happening, or if it is a serious structural issue, or if there's something else going on. So those would be the two that I can think of.
Great. I don't see any further questions. Still looking here. I will say that the standards often incite the most discussion because it can be interpreted in so many different ways, especially that standard number 9, and it can be subjective based on one person's opinion of how differentiated and compatible a building is. I think that was the point of today's title, which is compatible matchy-matchy, which I think was a nice little tongue-in-cheek way of kind of talking about the challenges of interpreting these things, but they are also, as you mentioned, clear guidelines that if you look at them from a practical, straightforward standpoint, it should be very clear whether or not you're following the standards. I don't know if you have anything to say to that. I was sort of just killing time to see if anybody else had questions.
Well, yeah, and I think that's a good point, John. And I think sometimes too, the level of historic significance and prominence of a property may feed into how it's being addressed. There might be a higher level of sensitivity with like one of the most significant public properties versus a smaller residents in a historic district. There could be different considerations to some extent. Some wild differentiation has happened with modern additions to historic buildings in some cases, and some of those have been successful in certain instances, I think.
Sometimes controversy is good. Yeah, so thank you both for your time today. I don't want to keep us here longer than we need to be. Obviously, we still have time for questions, but I can, if you email us, I'm happy to forward any questions to our panelists and they can answer you by email. I also wanted to mention that we do have a feedback form. This time, I know last time I hadn't yet put it up, but it's available now. So if you go to the link that I just pasted into the chat box, you can let us know what you thought of today's program. Somebody's asking if we could provide a link to the Secretary Standards for the cultural landscapes. I'm sure we can do that. I had it up a minute ago because there was that question about walkways and driveways. But anyways, while we're trying to find that link for you, just a reminder, everybody will be receiving, here's the guidelines for the treatment to cultural landscapes. So I'll paste that.
Thank you.
Everybody should be receiving a link to the recording after this program, and also a reminder that this is just part 2 of what is it, 6 parts now? 6 parts until all the way until December. So this is an ongoing conversation, and we'll really be diving into the structural side of things here soon. So thank you all for your time today, and CPF is happy to be a part of this, and we will be making the recordings available to you. Any final words from our speakers?
Oh, thanks, John.
Oh,
Okay.
thank you, everybody.
Well, we will see you for the next program, which I don't have the date right in front of me, but you can check our website for the next one, unless either of you have it.
The next one is on August 30th, which is a Tuesday.
Thank you. So August 30th, and it appears from the responses that 5 to 7 worked best for the people in the room. So maybe we will continue to hold these from 5 to 7. We'll see. So we look forward to seeing you in